Thank you very much, Sister Mary. I'm now going to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Simon, who is going to talk you through the online groups. And you will have seen, and if you haven't looked at them already, I'm not going to steal your thunder, please come and look at the posters. The first time we've done posters for the online groups, but they're beautiful. So please come and look at them at some point. But it's over to Simon now. Thank you.
Benvenuti a tutti. Welcome everyone. For those who don't know me, as Tina said, I'm Simon Davies on the organising committee, and I think I've been given the easiest task of the whole organising committee to summarise 12 international groups and their feedback over 3 months of meetings. So no easy task. What I thought I'd do, though, is to set the scene and to really acknowledge one of our group members from Africa, Sister Lillian Ebo. Is she here? I did look for Sister Lillian. There was a few visa issues, I think, for a few African delegates, so unfortunately she's not here to read her poem to you, but she was moved through her interactions in her particular working group to author a poem. And I'll try and do it justice in reading it to you on her behalf. I woke up to the wonder of my being. I was called a woman. I sought the world if there was anything else. I questioned and I wondered. Alas, I am a woman of strength. In my imagination, I lived. In my innermost being, I survived. All around me, I craved and grappled. I grappled only to discover that. I was a woman of faith. In my world, I questioned survival. Happiness seemed like a mirage. Sadness seemed like the only option. Happiness, sadness, and pains the only hope for survival. Alas, there stood a woman of strength. O my world, O my being, O the creator of women. Where art thou in all my world? Alas, I could hear the voice calling. O you women of faith, in the morning there came light. Shades of hopes formed the many voices, voices from deep within, voices from my outside world saying, you are a woman of strength, you are a woman of faith. And I think that sets the tone for our reflection this afternoon on the working groups. As you're well aware, because most of you are part of a group, they convened online and in person between February and May this year, with 12 regions this year, all meeting across the globe. And there was discussions facilitated on various issues relating to safeguarding and the women's roles. And the outputs of those groups were a final report and the visual posters that Tina's pointed out here on either side of me. And I will attempt to bring out some themes that have emerged from those reports and also from the posters. The monthly sessions were structured as follows in those 4 particular areas, and then they were asked to really look at 3 integral questions to answer in providing their final report that are there. So as I mentioned, firstly I'll explore what I felt were the common themes amongst all groups, no matter what part of the world people were from. So across regions, the entrenchment of patriarchal systems and clerical dominance emerged as significant barriers to women's empowerment and safeguarding. And the pervasive culture of silence, often reinforced by shame and fear, prevents many women from speaking out. And women are at the forefront of safeguarding, often providing support and advocacy without formal acknowledgement or authority. And there are structural inequalities, including economic dependence and cultural norms, compound the risks women face, necessitating comprehensive approaches to address these layers of oppression. And transformative change requires systemic reforms, inclusive leadership, and the elevation of survivors' voices to reshape safeguarding practices effectively. And there are obviously significant differences between the regions also, as you'd expect, and I'll explore those in our next section. So moving to Africa, the Anglophone African group identified fear, not only emotional but cultural, spiritual and institutional, as a major mechanism sustaining abuse. Victims fear not being believed, losing their place in religious life or damaging family honour. They also highlighted structural barriers, inadequate complaint pathways, limited economic options and the internalisation of silence due to patriarchal norms. Abuse is compounded when church authorities are not held accountable or when female religious have no independent support mechanisms. I believe their poster is one of the most powerful symbolic representations submitted for ISC 2025. It is titled Embodiments of the Silenced Victim and is framed by a stark proverb: "The power of the lion lies in our fear of it." In other words, what we do not confront will control us. The group chose to structure their poster in two panels. On the left, we see the reality of what they call forget everything and run, a state of fear. This side depicts the internal dialogue of countless survivors. Shut up, you're ugly, nobody will believe you, it's all your fault. These messages, imposed by abusers, internalised through cultural stigma, reinforced by patriarchal norms, create what the group calls embodiments of silencing. The overlapping hands covering the woman's face represent community complicity, societal judgment and institutional failure. But then there is a turning point. The right-hand panel reclaims power through a new acronym, Face Everything and Rise. Here we see the African woman reimagined as a warrior. She is not passive, she is prepared, and each piece of her armour symbolises a safeguarding principle. Shield, emotional resilience and protection. Armour, boundaries and self-worth. Spear, assertiveness and the ability to seek help. Headgear, mental clarity and critical thinking. Footwear, grounding in community, values and stability. Belt, self-regulation, discipline and dignity. Jewellery, self-love and healing from abuse. This metaphor, the warrior fully equipped for safeguarding, is their proposal for how women, communities and the church should respond. The message is not individualistic but deeply communal. Safeguarding must be rooted in cultural identity, adapted to context and spiritually grounded. Then moving to South America, the group reported that clericalism across lay and ordained sectors continues to inhibit women's roles and trivialise abuse disclosures. Power is deeply embedded in church structures and theological discourse. Furthermore, women's leadership and safeguarding roles are often symbolic. Actual decision-making power remains concentrated in male clerical hands, limiting women's influence in shaping policies or responding meaningfully to cases of harm. Their vibrant collage-style poster is titled Weaving Networks of Listening, Support and Hope. It uses visual metaphors to communicate not only the lived experience of women survivors of abuse, but also the community-based solutions that safeguarding must pursue. Each visual element in the poster has been chosen with symbolic intent, and the layout itself mimics a tapestry of communal weaving, emphasising connection, interdependence and collective resilience. The left-hand column introduces the core conditions of harm, which are identified as dependence, women's social and economic dependency on male authority figures or religious superiors, which restricts autonomy and increases vulnerability. Guilt, the internalised sense of fault or shame, often reinforced by cultural expectations that women should endure or remain silent. And cycles of violence, the systemic repetition of harm due to structural inequalities, family violence and institutional complicity. Moving to Poland, the Polish group exposed the continued silencing of abuse within female congregations, where obedience, spiritual manipulation, and misinterpreted community values discourage reporting. They also identified deep-seated cultural myths. Women must be polite, must not cause conflict, and should endure suffering quietly. These ideas inhibit women from recognising abuse, especially when it's emotional, spiritual, or systemic rather than physical. I apologise to a priest, father I met earlier from Nagasaki for my pronunciation, Father. They called themselves the Kintsugi group, inspired by the Japanese practice of repairing broken pottery with gold. Their poster is a visual embodiment of that metaphor. Women as vessels, wounded, yes, but also healed and strengthened through solidarity, truth and justice. Central to their reflection is a quote from Edith Stein, also known as St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, a Carmelite martyr and patroness of Europe. A woman's soul lives more intensely. This quote anchors their vision. Women's capacity for empathy, suffering and relational depth has historically been exploited rather than honoured, particularly in religious settings. The poster includes keywords that speak to both the causes of harm and the structures that perpetuate silence. Dependency, protecting in isolation, patriarchal mentality, boundaries, solidarity. The group also pointed to several taboo topics: the emotional and sexual abuse that occurs between women religious, the use of confession or spiritual direction to exert coercive control, the hidden suffering of nuns, transferred maliciously, overworked, or silenced when they speak out. Despite these challenges, their tone is hopeful. They describe a shift underway. More women religious now speak publicly, include safeguarding information, and demand space to name harm. The poster reflects this transition, not from brokenness to perfection, but from silence to collective voice. The Italian group focused on the specific vulnerabilities of migrant women, particularly undocumented individuals, who are exploited, ignored by services, and often re-traumatised when seeking help from church or civic authorities. They also noted that church responses to abuse are often shaped by a desire to protect reputation, not victims. Theological justifications, such as spiritualising obedience, were seen to shield perpetrators and silence the abused. They produced this bold and visually minimalist poster that makes a profound statement using 4 key terms: resilience, justice, gazes, patriarchy. The poster's central text reads, "By rediscovering the strength of collective resilience, we reaffirm the urgency of a justice capable of breaking down patriarchal structures and opening itself to new perspectives, ones that can embrace, protect and transform." First, resilience is not portrayed as individual perseverance, but as a collective force, a shared capacity for survival, healing and redefinition. The group explicitly rejected the idea that safeguarding is about personal coping or quiet endurance. Instead, they assert that resilience must lead to systemic transformation. That leads to their second concept, justice. For this group, justice is not simply due process or institutional compliance. It is political, theological and social. Justice means redistributing power, particularly by demasculinising church. It requires the active renunciation of male privilege, including within religious orders, seminaries and episcopal governance. Gazes refers to perspective and visibility. The group called for a re-education of how we look at victims, at women and at the church. Too often women's suffering is seen either as peripheral or spiritualised. New gazes require us to see survivors as agents, not as burdens, to view safeguarding as central to ecclesial credibility, not as an administrative burden. And patriarchy is named not abstractly, but concretely. The group reported that in Italy, women still face structural unemployment and wage disparity, religious messaging that portrays them as inherently submissive or as Eves, the manipulation of obedience and spiritual guidance, and persistent exclusion from theological, canonical, and pastoral leadership. The Mexican group highlighted the extreme risk facing migrant women, many fleeing violence in Central America only to face assault, trafficking, or exploitation during their journey. They also critiqued clericalism and machismo in church culture, noting that many women working in safeguarding or accompanying victims are still excluded from leadership or systemically sidelined in church commissions and canonical processes. The group structured their reflection around a theologically grounded but institutionally challenging statement. A church without women is like imagining the apostles without Mary. This framing makes clear that women are not supplementary to the church and safeguarding, they are central. The group described how women are often the ones offering accompaniment, psychological support, pastoral presence, and practical care to survivors, yet their roles are still undervalued or unrecognised by church structures. The group identified two dominant barriers to effective safeguarding in the Mexican context: cultural machismo, a widespread social norm that discourages women from reporting abuse, limits their participation in leadership, and reinforces harmful gender roles; and clericalism, a culture that prioritises institutional image over truth and silence both survivors and the women supporting them. The group noted that canonical and pastoral processes are often inaccessible, re-traumatising, or dismissive of women's expertise. In response, the group called for structural and cultural transformation, specifically zero tolerance principles, women's leadership, economic empowerment initiatives, and justice centres and pastoral support spaces. The group closed their reflection by urging the church to move beyond symbolic inclusion. Women, they insisted, are already doing the work of safeguarding. What is needed now is visibility, authority, and co-responsibility, so that healing and justice can become real, not rhetorical. A big contingent from the Philippines, so there's two groups, so I'll go through both. But the two groups from the Philippines identified that women face barriers to reporting not only because of family and cultural expectations, but because legal and church systems often reinforce male dominance. The group reported that even when abuse is recognised, women are silenced through shame, reputational threats, or fear of expulsion from church or ministry roles. They called for survivor-led reforms and increased female participation in ecclesial decision-making. The first group titled their poster "Bravehearts, Asian Voices for the Vulnerable," and structured their poster around three key concepts: empowerment, patriarchy, and voice. Their first focus, empowerment, highlighted the transformative potential of women when allowed to lead, decide, and speak. They argued that women do not just change themselves, they change families, parishes, and entire communities. However, this potential remains constrained by cultural and religious systems that deny them full agency. The second theme, patriarchy, was framed not just as a cultural phenomenon, but as a deeply embedded system operating across laws, traditions, and church institutions. The group described how patriarchy silences women, justifies control, and sustains environments where abuse is normalised or ignored. They noted that this system does not need to be violent to be harmful. It operates subtly through exclusion and minimisation. Third, the group lifted up voice as the heart of safeguarding. For them, voice represents truth-telling, resistance, and hope. They observed that many women in their region are still unable to speak freely due to fear of disbelief, retaliation, or spiritual judgment. Where women have spoken, they have often been marginalised rather than listened to. The group's assertion was clear: a woman's voice is her power. The second group from Cebu City framed their poster around three questions: on the potential of women, They stressed that women already hold essential roles in family, community and church life. When supported by education, leadership opportunities and legal protection, they emerged not only as survivors but as leaders of transformation from grassroots to policy levels. The second section examines barriers. The group points to deeply embedded patriarchal norms, especially within church structures, that objectify women, silence disclosures, and perpetuate violence through shame, obedience, and institutional power imbalances. They note that vows of obedience, especially in religious life, can be weaponised to silence or control women. This third section proposes solutions. Begin gender-sensitive education early, provide legal aid, shelters and psychological support, promote collaboration between genders in leadership, and cultivate community-based safeguarding cultures that include women at every level. In summary, the Cebu City Group calls for transformation not through charity but through equity, giving women the authority, voice and safety to lead safeguarding reforms themselves. The Central and Eastern Europe Group reflected on how cultural and religious systems often frame women's freedom as conditional, acceptable only when it fits conventional roles like caregiver, mother or obedient follower. They also noted that theology is frequently used to justify gender inequality. Women are expected to be submissive or sacrificial and rarely participate in the formation of liturgical or moral teaching. These factors severely limit their safety and self-determination. I think there's some people in the groups that miss their calling as artists, but that's just my reflection. They produce this sharply analytical and politically aware reflection on the realities faced by women in their region. Their poster divided into three sections: empowerment, underestimated, and participation. Empowerment. The group challenged the assumption that women's capacity for self-determination is natural or automatic. They argued that it is in fact the outcome of historic struggle, a process shaped by marginalisation, resistance and the building of solidarity across generations. They noted that societies often recognise women's value only when it aligns with utility or productivity. But true empowerment, they asserted, must include autonomy, emotional agency and freedom from externally imposed roles. Underestimated explores the cultural, social and religious factors that inhibit women's freedoms. Here, the group was especially critical of the misuse of religion, for example, limiting women's roles in the church, portraying God exclusively in male terms, and reinforcing obedience as a virtue for women but not men. They observed that patriarchal norms reduce women to fixed identities: wife, mother, helper, while punishing those who challenge expectations. Women are seen not as full moral and theological agents, but as support figures to male leadership. Participation is a direct appeal for structural change. The group argues that safeguarding cannot succeed unless women have full and equal access to participation in social, political and ecclesial life. The United Kingdom and Ireland group criticised the minimising language often used when discussing abuse against women. They observed that descriptions of male victims tend to emphasise trauma, while female experiences are framed with softer, less serious terminology. They also noted a lack of institutional understanding of trauma-informed safeguarding. There is little professional supervision, limited integration of survivors' experiences, and inconsistent responses to adult disclosures, particularly in diocesan structures. Their poster mirrors the clarity and precision of their final report. It is structured under 4 categories: education, culture, knowledge, and expectations. Education. The group identified a fundamental need to reframe safeguarding as an issue of justice, not only compliance. They advocated for church-wide education on healthy relationships, power dynamics, and gender-based violence, grounded not only in secular human rights frameworks, but also in Catholic social teaching. They emphasised that awareness raising is not enough. Formation must translate into practice, policy and leadership reform. Culture. The group names several persistent dynamics within the church and wider society that inhibit women's safety. The internalisation of shame, stigmas around sexuality, clerical defensiveness, a normative ideal of female obedience and politeness. These, they argued, often lead women to normalise abusive behaviours or remain silent due to fear of being blamed or not believed. Knowledge. The group raised a critical challenge. There is a severe lack of data around adult women's experiences of abuse in church contexts. They noted that even when reports exist, there is frequently a failure to act on the findings. The group called for systemic data collection and public transparency, not only about the abuse of minors, but also about spiritual, emotional and sexual abuse of adult women, including religious and lay personnel. And expectations was where their tone shifted from diagnostic to directive. The group consciously chose expectations over hopes or suggestions to signal urgency. They made it clear that cultural change requires trauma-informed safeguarding at all levels of church leadership, safe spaces where disclosures are met with belief and follow-through, and accountability for past failures, not just apologies for institutional reform. The Australian group observed that women lead most safeguarding work in church contexts, yet they lack the authority to make binding decisions or reform processes. Clericalism, in their view, is not merely theological, but structural. Men control governance. Women execute, but do not legislate. This has produced a safeguarding culture that is under-resourced, overburdened, and frequently dismissed. Their poster, entitled Strong Women, Strong Church, brings together professional safeguarding knowledge and lived experience of those working within church structures. It distills complex realities into three central headings: empowerment, silencing and restoration. Empowerment. The group asserted that women already carry the wisdom, courage and expertise to lead change in safeguarding. They are not waiting to be equipped. They are already doing the work. What's missing is institutional recognition. The group made clear that safeguarding leadership must be transferred, not merely supported. Women must be entrusted with decision-making power, resourced appropriately, and included in governance beyond tokenism. Silencing points to the institutional dismissal of women's voices, especially those of survivors and female professionals. The group observed that many safeguarding systems are shaped by clericalism, where women's experiences are filtered through male hierarchies and where language around harm is softened or spiritualised rather than confronted. They highlighted that in safeguarding commissions and diocesan structures, women often lead the day-to-day work but are excluded from strategic decision-making. Their knowledge is often seen as supportive rather than authoritative. Restoration frames safeguarding not as a process of managing allegations, but of restoring dignity. The group advocated for trauma-informed safeguarding that is relational, ongoing and survivor-led. They stress that effective safeguarding includes professional supervision and psychological safety for those supporting victims, policies that include gender-sensitive pathways and power-conscious processes, and cultural change within parishes and institutions that values empathy over control. Both the North American and Canadian groups distinguish themselves from other groups by rejecting the original questions posed by groups as structurally misframed, demanding instead a church-centred focus on accountability. And we welcome this challenge. They also uniquely critique canon law and adult safeguarding failures, calling for reforms to protect adult women from spiritual, emotional and sexual abuse. The groups felt the ISC questions were paternalistic, disempowering and misdirected. They proposed flipping the questions to centre institutional accountability rather than female capacity, asserting that the issue is not what women can do, but what the church must do. That's got people talking, hasn't it? The first group took a bold and deliberate approach to their poster. They went with a minimalist but technologically advanced approach that I'm extremely impressed with, Father Matthew. No poster shows the pain, no art captures the anguish, no headline shares the hope, see what we have to say. This is not a rejection of the visual medium, it's a lament, in my view. An expression that a poster can adequately capture the complexity, trauma and institutional frustration expressed during the group's 4-month reflections. Their decision stems from several key themes in their final report. The inadequacy of the Church's structures to protect adult women, deep disillusionment with institutional responses to abuse, and a recognition that the problem is not women's capacity, it is the system that fails them. As I mentioned, the group proposed flipping the original ISC questions. For example, instead of asking, what is the potential for women to become protagonists, they ask, what structural changes must the Church commit to in order to recognise the leadership of women who already possess agency? Their poster then is not empty, it is charged with decades of institutional neglect, the exhaustion of survivors and the repeated failure of systems to listen or act. The QR code invites people to read the full report, but I think this is even symbolic itself. It shifts the burden from superficial engagement to deeper reading, from aesthetics to accountability. This group reminds us that sometimes the most powerful act of safeguarding is to resist the urge to package trauma. Their silence on the page is not absence, it's protest. The second group's poster centres on the theme of hope, but this is not abstract hope. It is rooted in confrontation with the entrenched structures of inequality, especially clericalism, which they identify as a primary enabler of abuse. They make clear that the Church's male-only hierarchical model fosters not only exclusion, but actual harm. Clericalism distorts spiritual authority and gives rise to physical, emotional and spiritual abuse. Importantly, they highlight that this imbalance is not only perpetuated by clergy, but also by laity who elevate priests beyond accountability. This dual dynamic, the pedestal and the power, is what leaves women vulnerable. Their reflection concludes with concrete safeguarding imperatives: embedding abuse awareness into clergy formation programs, training all church personnel to identify early signs of abuse, creating a reporting culture that empowers women to set boundaries, and ensuring those subjected to abusive power are heard and accompanied. Their poster frames safeguarding as both a structural reform and a cultural re-education project, one that must begin inside the Church if it is to remain credible outside of it. I believe these key words encapsulate the essence of all the discussions, reflecting the shared aspirations and challenges identified across all the groups. And could I please ask all of the group facilitators to stand and us to show our appreciation for their hard work over many months. On behalf of the organising committee, we're always very grateful because I know it's a lot of time and pain, I'm sure. By showing the maps earlier, I was intentionally not giving you a geography lesson, but I kept colouring the world map as I presented intentionally to highlight the reach of the conference, which I think all of us as conference participants should be proud of, extremely proud of. This conference is all of us. But I would like to highlight the corners of the world that are underrepresented here and would urge you to consider and provide us, as Father Hans called for earlier, and provide us with feedback on how we can improve this into the future. I think certainly from my perspective there's an underrepresented amount of Asia and we'd welcome your thoughts on how we include them. And on that note, I leave you with the words of Sister Lillian. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and please come and say hello. Grazie mille.